Hi everybody. Thank you to be there for this fifth conference on the thematics of human resources. So as we have said earlier, today's teams are becoming more flexible with increased opportunities to work online and with team members located all across the globe. Of course, this linguistic and cultural diversity of these teams creates difficulties, but also gives these teams special advantages. In this conference, we will see how language diversity influences teams that work online and how we can improve communication in our changing work environment. So let me introduce you to Danielle Taylor. She received her PhD in management from Université Grenoble-Alpes in 2022. She's currently a researcher and lecturer at Sciences Po Grenoble. Danielle is leading member of INTERCCOM Games, which creates serious games for improving work in international teams, and she is co-inventor of Gena Game, a gaming platform where the serious games are housed. Danielle, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for joining me today to talk about how serious games can be an incredibly powerful tool to teach and learn about soft skills. What I want to talk about today is in two parts. First, I want to talk about what skills are really necessary to work in an international online environment. And second, I want to talk about how serious games and simulations are a way to improve our skills. At the end of my presentation, I'm very happy to respond to questions in either French or English. So I think that this is a very familiar situation to all of us. We all have experience working online, whether that is extensive, maybe every day, or a little less so, maybe once in a while. What we maybe see a little bit less is how language and language diversity is also an important part of this interaction. We have languages that are intervening, and these languages can create challenges, but they can also be very important advantages to a team. They can create diversity in the ideas that we have and ultimately lead to more better performing teams. Of course, when we're talking about language, we're also talking about communication. So I want to come really quickly to soft skills, the soft skills that we need for working in an international team. When we talk about soft skills, we talk often about communication. We're also talking about creativity, problem solving, teamwork, these ideas that are quite difficult to acquire, these skills that are quite difficult to acquire, but they're really foundational. We see a tendency in job descriptions and requirements that are requiring more and more soft skills. And this is even more happening these days with the rise of remote and autonomous work. It's happening across all industries, across all job levels, and across all work environments. So what do we really mean by communication? What are communication skills? How can we even qualify them or quantify them? Well, first we need to remember that communication happens in a group. It happens between at least two people. There is someone that is giving a message, and there's someone that is interpreting that message. So if we think about criteria for effective communication, we're thinking, for example, about what is the reality of the problem or the event that is happening. What are the simple facts? But we also really need to underline the second point here about individual interpretation. It is the individual that is receiving the message that is interpreting this message based on their own meaning, based on their language level even. And this individual interpretation is really key to advance in communication. Now, third, there is a point about personal commitment. How involved am I in this communication? What is the implication on my personal level that also has an influence on how effective this communication is? So we understand that communication is important and that communication goes beyond a simple language proficiency. But what becomes a little bit more complicated is how can we actually learn and acquire these soft skills? So I believe that games, serious games, and simulations are incredible, powerful tools to help us acquire these skills. And that is specifically because we're looking at experiential learning. We're putting people into a realistic context that is a bit less pressure than a completely real context. They're having the opportunity to test different ways of communicating, and they're seeing how that influences the other person's response. So the game that I want to talk about really quickly, the game that I believe is really useful for learning communication in a multilingual and virtual team, is a game that I created for my PhD research. It's called Elite the Serious Game. Of course, it is based a lot on making a situation as realistic as possible. So we'll be playing with different characters, we'll see videos and we'll be interacting with them, receiving emails and communicating with them in different ways. The idea is that it's an immersive game. We're immersing ourselves into this situation, which happens to be organizing an international event. But what is really important is how we are communicating with that team and what decisions we are ultimately making in order to succeed at the end of the game. This game is something that is continually evolving, which is one aspect that makes it unique compared to other games that are out there. On one hand, it is a serious game in that it is providing some educational objective and resources. So the player is receiving a personalized assessment as to what are those communication strategies that they are using and how effective are they doing it. And there's also advice that comes throughout the game. So it happens at the end and throughout the game. But here we're also collecting data. So as a researcher, I see what people are doing in specific situations. And I'm looking at the trends that are happening, whether that is based on the player's language level or maybe their national language. I'm looking at this in different levels. But all of this data that I collect is very interesting because then I can reuse that information to then continue to improve the feedback within the game so that the player has the most up-to-date information about the latest trends and what is most important for communication. And also how that communication relates to performance of the actual team. So I just want to go ahead and maybe present two situations that happen within this game so that you can see what it looks like a little bit and we can talk about some of the feedback. So the game is set up to look like you're working on your computer. So you're working with your virtual international team. You receive emails. So here we have an email coming from the CEO. She's giving you a task to work on specifically. This task happens to be with choosing a location and a theme for the event. But what is really important is that it's giving you information that this is the first time you're meeting your international team. And this is the first time that you're going to be brainstorming with them on an idea. So the question here is, how do you prefer to discuss your first team task? Do you want to continue by email? Do you want to start a group chat? Do you want to have an audio-only call or a video call? So I'm curious, what would you respond? Yeah? Number 4, video call? A bit of a consensus? Yeah. And I think that's quite normal for all of us, and we'll discuss why. So when we're looking, we'll discuss why in just a second, but first we want to talk about why we're choosing different communication channels for different situations. So when we're working in this multilingual virtual team, it's all about finding the right mix of different communication channels. We don't want to only use one channel, such as email, for all of our communication, because simply it doesn't work. The team will not perform as well, and even not get on along as well. But we're wanting to find the right mix of channels, which is based on two things. It's based on the type of information we want to convey. So is this an opportunity to get to know each other? Is it an opportunity to brainstorm? Or are we just wanting to give a simple piece of information? We're also looking at the urgency of a response. So do I need a response very quickly? Do I also want to see facial expressions or other gestures? Would that help me? Do I want to hear voice intonation? That can all have a very big effect on the communication. While we're choosing different communication channels, we're doing it for two reasons. First, to communicate efficiently and effectively. We want to make sure that our communication is being done and we're getting the job done, of course. But second, we also need to build that social presence, because teams that are working online have even more difficulty building this social presence than teams that work in person. So we want to reinforce that aspect. And one way to reinforce that aspect is by bringing communication as close to face-to-face as possible, for example, through video calls. So when we're looking at some tendencies in player responses, such as that situation that I showed you, your tendency was to choose a video call. That is probably for a couple of reasons. First, you want to meet your team. You want to build those social dynamics. Second, you're contacting a mixed proficiency group. And when you're contacting a mixed proficiency group in general, it can be good to turn to a video call for language reasons. In comparison, imagine that we needed to contact one team member, and this one team member has a lower level of English or whatever the common language is. Well, your tendency then might be to turn to email. That can be very helpful in teams with great language diversity. And that is because we're giving that person the opportunity to use an online translator, to turn to another colleague for help, and to use all of those other resources to give them some time to think about how they want to respond. And it ultimately becomes more efficient for that person if we turn to more of a written communication. Some tendencies also that we can look about on the far right, we see that higher English proficiency leads to a tendency to choose a richer media being closer to face-to-face. It's a lot to do with a comfort level. Am I comfortable speaking in this language? What we can also see, though, and maybe a point to be aware of, is that richer media positively influences perceptions of trust and team performance. So when we have team members that maybe don't have as high of an English proficiency, we still need to be able to reinforce the team dynamics by maybe having some limited video calls, or maybe turning to other types of communication such as chat, instant messaging, and incorporating that in other ways. So we do need to we don't want to only communicate by email with this person if we want to have a strong team. I want to next share a second situation in this game that is much more directly related to language. So here we have some team members that are meeting for a video call. We have our French team members on the left, and Filipa from Portugal is arriving, but she's a bit late. So as team coordinator, how do we want to greet Filipa? Do we want to greet her only in English? Do we want to greet her in Portuguese, or maybe a mix? What do you think? And there's no right or wrong answer here, but your tendency. I see a 2, a 3, okay, a 1, a 2, a 2. So I think that, as I said, there is no correct response. It depends on the team itself, and it depends on the language the language levels of the different team members being involved. But what we can see in a general sense, this relates to the concept of code switching. Code switching is simply switching from one language to another. The advice that we could look at is that in general, we want to avoid code switching when we're in group settings. So we don't want to completely change to Portuguese and have a chat with Filipa in Portuguese about hello, welcome, how's your day going? Because that actually creates a disconnect with the rest of the team. So while sometimes it can be important to switch for means of explaining something, it's always important to come back as quickly as possible to the language of the team. So that's what I call full code switching, when we're switching completely. But there's a subtle difference here that we can also see with partial code switching. Partial in that maybe we're using a mix of languages. We're being a bit more multilingual as it is. And that is something that can be very positive in a team. When we implement some different code switching scenarios, so for example, if we choose 2 here, it's actually going to show a goodwill within the team. And some teams really appreciate integrating those multilingual aspects because it's showing that you are understanding and taking consideration of each other's identities. Another thing to recognize here is that full and partial code switching do have opposite effects on teams. In fact, if we look at full code switching, switching completely, it can have negative effects on team performance and on group identification, so that group dynamics and coming together. But partial actually has exactly the opposite benefit, that it can be quite positive, that teams feel that they are performing better once we integrate some multilingual aspects. So that was just 2 situations that I wanted to demonstrate within the game to show you that it's interesting to be able to go into the game, which is a simulation, answer questions which are still moving the story forward, because once I choose to respond to Filipa in Portuguese, maybe she'll respond back to me in Portuguese, we don't know. But it's a powerful way to be able to practice those different skills. Ultimately, I think that serious games like these can be very important training tools on 2 levels. First, it can be for upskilling individuals. On an individual level, I can analyze my communication strategies and see how that might fit into these international situations. On another level, it can be quite interesting and useful for organizations to implement these sort of games into training programs and not only have the employees or participants play the game, but also take it one step further by discussing it and putting into place different communication strategies and norms that are decided together by the team members. So that is the game that I wanted to present. I am also letting everyone here to try the game for free. You can contact me by email. I also have a flyer that I can give you so that you can have access to try it for yourself. Thank you.